Welcome to everyone who has just joined over the last minute or so. Thank you all for being here. My name is Helen Schroeder, and I am the marketing coordinator at Sigma Assessment Systems. I'll be moderating your webinar for you today, and facilitating the presentation will be my colleague Leonid Beletsky. First, a brief introduction to Sigma for any of you who haven't heard of us before. We are a professional services firm that offers talent development, succession planning, and assessments for organizations who are looking to build their internal talent pools. Sigma has been in business for over 50 years. So as a company, our consultants and talent development experts have had a lot of experience to bring to you. And as you know, today we are going to be talking about the 9-box grid. So before we dive in, I have a few points on housekeeping. We've got about 60 minutes together, and for the first 45 minutes or so, Leonid will take you through the content of our webinar to introduce the 9-box grid, what it is, how to use it, some of the limitations, and some of the extra materials that Sigma has to support you in using that for talent development. As we go, feel free to post any questions that you have in the Q&A box at the bottom of your webinar screen. I'll answer some of those as we go, especially if they're technical questions. And any more general questions that the group would benefit from hearing an answer, I will save for the Q&A at the end. We'll take about 10 minutes to go through those together. And if you have more questions that come up live as we're in discussion, those are welcome too. If there's something that we don't get to in our webinar today, or if you'd like to follow up on any of the content, feel free to email us. We will have our contact information on the slides. And this webinar is also being recorded. So we will not be sharing the slides after the webinar, but we will share the recording once it's been posted on the website tomorrow. Okay, and now without any further ado, I will introduce you to Leo. Leo is pursuing his PhD in industrial organizational psychology at Western University. His research is primarily focused on investigating factors that contribute to optimal work motivation, well-being, and performance. He also maintains his interests in psychometric assessments and personality. And at Sigma, Leonid applies his expertise to supporting the consulting team with succession planning and talent and leadership development. So things like this webinar today. And I will pass it off now to Leonid to get started.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Helen, for the introduction. Thanks everybody for joining. Hope everyone's doing well today. So let's just kind of dive in here. Starting off with a quick little agenda. So here's a general overview of what we're going to talk about today. So first, we'll go over what the 9-box actually is. We'll go over some of its key benefits as well as some of its limitations. Later on, we'll get into Sigma's own 9-box template, why it's a better tool and how you can use it in your talent development efforts. Closer to the end, we'll go over some key takeaways and additional tips, and throughout the presentation, I'll reiterate some of the key takeaway points as we go as well. And throughout the presentation, we would also like to hear about your experiences. So for this reason, we have also included a few polls, which you will see pop up on your screen. So on that note, let's start off with the poll right away. So our question to you is, does your organization currently use the 9-box grid? Okay, we've got a nice kind of even split throughout these options, which is good. So the kind of the things we'll talk about today should apply to pretty much everyone here. Yes, we used it in the past, 24%. Yes, we're using it now, 44%. And no, we've never used it, 31%. So for those who have never used it, perhaps after today, you might consider using it or some aspect of it. And then for those who are currently using, hopefully today will help you kind of apply it in a better fashion. All right. So in terms of the actual content, we can get started with that now. So as many of you know, talent development processes, while absolutely critical, are quite the challenge to conceptualize, implement, and also evaluate. And since talent development processes are uniquely tailored to organizations, it can be quite challenging to know where to actually begin with the whole process. Now, the 9-box grid can be used as sort of a starting point to generate a high-level overview of your current talent pool. And then as such, it can help guide subsequent development efforts based on where employees land on this grid. So how does this grid fit into the talent development context, and what might actually constitute a talent development effort? So first of all, what is a talent development initiative? Generally, it refers to a structured program or set of activities designed to identify and nurture the skills, abilities, and potential of individuals in order to enhance their performance and maximize their contributions to an organization or to a broader field. It often aims to develop and retain talented individuals, providing them with opportunities for growth, opportunities for learning, and advancement within the organization. So a few examples might be, some sort of technical skills training, leadership development initiatives, or mentorship programs. Basically anything that your organization implements to help your employees grow and develop. Evidence generally suggests that thoughtful investment in talent development is associated with positive organizational outcomes, of course, as long as resources are allocated properly. So today we'll first go over the traditional 9-box framework, and then we'll discuss how Sigma has made some changes there. So how exactly do we at Sigma situate the 9-box within the scope of our offerings? Generally, it's used as a tool to shortlist individuals for participation in high potential talent development programs. Here on the screen, you'll see a kind of brief outline of our 5-stage talent development process. Stage 1 consists of creating a benchmark. Stage 2 consists of assessing employees' potential against this benchmark. Once we get past that stage, you can shortlist participants for your development program. And once you know who's actually participating, the whole process can begin. And then briefly at the final stage, although it's kind of an ongoing process, is to ensure that the program includes a formal method for tracking and also measuring any sort of progress you might be making. So here's what the typical, or one could say traditional 9-box actually looks like. I'm sure many of you, based on our poll, have seen this many times. We'll kind of go over the general structure here. So the grid consists of 3 horizontal rows and 3 vertical columns. So as you can see, this creates 9 individual cells. On the x-axis, we see performance plotted, and on the y-axis, we see potential plotted against performance. Potential and performance are measured at the low, medium, and high level, as opposed to using a continuum. So the performance rating is typically based on things like, unsurprisingly, job performance, things like productivity, skills, etc. And it ranges from low to high, as you can see. The potential rating, we'll get into more detail about this later, but generally reflects an employee's future growth and development potential within the organization. Things like ability to take on new responsibilities, adaptability, leadership potential, and many other things. And these are represented on the horizontal axis. Again, everything from low to high potential. So each cell in the 9-box represents a specific combination of performance and potential ratings, and employees are placed in one of these cells based on the ratings. So we'll just go over some of the kind of more interesting distinctions on this grid here. So for example, in the top right, employees might be high achievers with potential for leadership roles and are typically considered top talent for future growth opportunities. In the top left, these employees show promise and potential, but possibly have not yet achieved high performance. They may require additional development and support to improve their performance. So on the bottom right, these employees consistently might perform well in their current roles, but they may have limited potential for advancement. They might be very valuable contributors, but potentially not suitable, at least at present, for higher level positions. And then we have a bunch of kind of middle cells. So these employees have average-ish ratings for both performance and potential. They might be stable performers, and they might require some targeted development to progress further. And then the employees on the bottom right section here consistently perform well, but have limited potential for growth within the organization. Actually, that one I think I already said. Now, the last one here that we should get to is the bottom left, where employees have both low performance and also limited potential. And these are situations where employees probably require some sort of intervention plan or performance improvement plan to address any deficiencies. So having gone through all of that, how does the 9-box generally support talent development efforts? So for one, it can provide a starting point to discuss the pool of talent in the organization. So in other words, a bird's eye view of where you currently stand once that grid is actually populated. It could help guide resource allocation decisions, so where time and money should be best directed from a talent development standpoint. It can also be helpful for HR documentation. So documenting levels of potential and performance, supporting proper human resource decision, and like I said, documentation as well. And on a longer time horizon, it could help support larger strategic initiatives like succession planning within your organization. So now again, we'd like to hear from you. Does your company have a formal talent development process in place? All right, let me just drag the poll results down here. Okay, it's good to see that people are engaged in talent development processes, whether they be kind of formalized or informal. But it's always good to see that these efforts are being made in organizations. Okay. So moving on now, let's get into some of the technical details of the 9-box tool. So as we already discussed, in the 9-box, performance can be categorized as low, as medium, or as high. A key point here is that performance is essentially a backward-looking metric of behavior, focusing on past actions of the employee. So in general, performance might refer to things like productivity, effectiveness, quality of work, basically looking at how employees are meeting, exceeding, or not meeting standards. So there could be a whole range of different key performance indicators or KPIs relevant to all sorts of different jobs. There's a huge list of different things that could be classified as performance, but I'm sure you kind of get the point. Some useful questions that one might ask themselves when implementing the 9-box process in the context of performance is, what performance measurement systems does my organization have in place currently? So in other words, what information can I actually draw upon? So we talked about some things people might draw upon, KPIs such as, I don't know, sales targets achieved, customer service ratings, production units, project deadlines, client satisfaction scores, anything like that. Now, the next question you might ask is, what criteria of these things that are relevant, that are available to me, what are actually relevant to my present objectives and needs? Which of these metrics can I use to populate this grid? And how do I align these metrics with low, medium, and high performance? So in other words, what does low, medium, and high actually look like within your organization? And another question to ask is, how does performance help inform the employee's potential in this case? And so in summary, kind of, how do I take all the performance metrics available within my organization and map them accurately onto the 9-box framework and then interpret the results? So let's move on to the next axis of the grid. How is potential generally assessed in the context of the typical 9-box? Now here things are arguably a little bit more complicated and a bit more nuanced. A key point is that potential is a more forward-looking, future-oriented metric. So thinking about what are the future performance expectations of this employee. Generally, potential refers to the sometimes latent abilities, skills, and capabilities that individuals possess, and can further develop to contribute to their current and future roles within the organization. So it can represent a sort of untapped capacity and growth opportunity that some employees hold, which can be potentially harnessed through training, development initiatives, and experience. And so these are the things that talent development programs are kind of designed to do. Yeah, so hopefully that gives a broad conceptual idea of how potential might be kind of discussed in this context. So some questions to ask about future performance. How is the employee in question or employees, how are they expected to grow? Does the employee demonstrate a willingness to learn, to acquire new skills? And does the employee demonstrate an ability to transfer learned material, new skills, etc., directly to on-the-job behaviors? This is far from an exhaustive list of questions, but it kind of helps get you in the right frame of mind when thinking about employee potential. And needless to say, answering these questions and determining what information to draw upon can be very difficult. Okay, so now let's talk about some of the kind of higher order benefits of using this grid. So first of all, it is somewhat easy to use and doesn't require much training. So, and you don't need a lot of time to explain how it works, provided you have the metrics to populate it. It can be, the framework overall can be applied to a wide variety of organizations, which is probably why it's such a popular tool. It can also provide, like I said earlier, an at-a-glance overview of your talent pool, and that's partially owing to its visual and intuitive appeal. Again, very easy to understand. And because of that too, it can be a good conversation starter with stakeholders about where you kind of stand in your talent development processes. So to summarize the benefits, using the 9-Box can result in substantial time and energy savings. But the important note here is that overuse or improper use of the 9-Box can lead to unfavorable consequences, which we will talk about next. So like I said, while there are some real benefits of the 9-Box approach, there are several drawbacks to be aware of. And these are kind of the main ones here. So first of all, categorizing employees into low, medium, and high boxes is not particularly detailed. So like I said earlier, what do these low, medium, and high categories actually mean? And there may not be enough granularity in performance data to actually categorize employees in this way. You might also not have enough range in your data to accurately place employees into these three categories. So if I was to summarize that, you need to determine what the norms are for performance and potential, kind of in order to use that low, medium, and high distinction. Otherwise, it washes out and becomes quite meaningless. There is a possibility of bias in leader ratings, and leader ratings are often used in the context of the 9-Box process. So some of the things to ask there are, is the leader a good judge of both performance and potential? Has the leader had sufficient time to actually observe the employee and speak to their potential? Leaders, for example, may at times focus too much on recent incidents, recent things that are salient within their minds at the expense of considering the kind of totality of an employee's performance or potential. Simple things such as just liking or disliking the employee can skew leader ratings. And this is particularly the case when ratings are provided in an unguided or unstructured fashion, when the criteria are not very clear, and that just contributes to a lot of measurement error. So that brings us to the next point about unclear criteria. The distinction between performance and potential is not always clear within organizations. So what exactly do performance and potential mean in the context of your specific organization? This distinction is often foggy at best, and the 9-Box in and of itself as a tool doesn't really give you any conceptual clarity there. So a great deal of time and effort has to go into defining how these things play out in your organization to receive any real benefit from the 9-Box tool. Now, a final point here is that employees may react negatively to being identified as low potential. So managing negative reactions in selection-oriented oriented processes like this is definitely a challenge. And the likelihood of negative reactions might actually increase if the process is perceived as unfair in some way. And again, this gets back to having good conceptual definitions, structured ratings, and whatnot. Employees might experience some anxiety or stress about being evaluated. They might become defensive or maybe disengaged, potentially might experience some drop in motivation in their work, things like that. So there's lots to be aware of when framing a potential negative result or not being selected into a high potential program. So overall, one should take care to involve the employee in the process and perhaps make sure that those identified as low potential are seeing perceived shortcomings as more of development opportunities as opposed to necessarily deficiencies. So things that we can work on basically. So I keep coming back to the importance of this conceptual distinction. And so we'll quickly go over some key points about distinguishing between performance and potential. So like I said, employee performance refers to the measurable outcomes and results that are achieved by an individual in their role within an organization. So it's an assessment of how well an employee fulfills job responsibilities, meets performance standards, and contributes to the overall goals and objectives of the organization. We went over some examples of kind of quantifiable metrics that performance can be based on. So now looking at employee potential, here we're referring to the innate abilities, somewhat innate abilities, skills, and capabilities an individual might possess, which key point here, they may or may not be fully realized or even utilized in the current role or level of responsibility of the individual. So like I said earlier, represents the capacity of an employee to grow, develop, and perform at higher levels within the organization. And so identifying and nurturing employee potential is important for talent management, succession planning, and providing general opportunities for career advancement and professional growth. And there's a wide range of ways that organizations assess employee potential, some cognitive abilities, creativity, problem-solving skills, leadership potential, adaptability, and all those things we kind of touched on earlier. So I would encourage you to think about how this distinction would play out in the context of your specific organization. So from what we have discussed so far, you can see that even though the 9-box can be a helpful supporting tool, it is not likely a sufficient standalone process. So the 9-box should be used in conjunction with objective, standardized metrics and procedures. So while we understand the value of the 9-box, we also have recommendations on how to use it more effectively. And after all, it is a tool that's used for pretty consequential HR decisions and therefore should be approached with quite a great deal of care. So let's get into what makes Sigma's 9-box a better tool. So like I said, while we see the value of the approach, we think it can be made better. So while rather than ranking employees roughly equally on performance and potential, Sigma's 9-box grid ranks employees primarily on potential. So this might seem counterintuitive or odd at first, but the reason Sigma's 9-box focuses mostly on potential is because talent development programs are basically by definition about nurturing potential into growth. And it's also important to note that potential is generally best measured using multiple perspectives rather than the input of only one individual, such as one leader who may or may not have had enough time to kind of get familiar with the employee and speak to these qualities. And this might also help ensure that development opportunities are more inclusive and accessible. So where did performance actually go? What do we do with it now? So it still plays a role. However, it should be primarily used for evaluating the effects of your talent development efforts, as opposed to using it as a standalone tool to decide, which employees do or do not deserve the investment. And past performance, it can be an indicator of potential, but it is not the only indicator of future growth potential. So to improve accuracy, Sigma's 9-box process uses data from multiple sources, also including the employee, to arrive at a more well-rounded and objective assessment. So now let's get into Sigma's actual 9-box template here. We'll be coming back to this several times and we'll look at some examples, but for now, let's just kind of go through a high level overview. So while the general format here at a glance looks pretty similar to the traditional or more common 9-box we looked at earlier, there are quite a few important distinctions. So instead of performance by potential on our axes here, the revised matrix plots leader rated potential against assessment rated potential. So assessment rated potential is the result of scores on a psychometric leadership assessment, whereas leader rated potential is how the leader views the qualities of the employee. So the grid here ranges from low potential to top potential, and there are quite a few nuanced distinctions in between that are not exactly made in the traditional 9-box. For example, an employee whose scores land in the hidden potential box might indicate a flight risk, for example, because their potential, as indicated by the psychometric assessment, is not being recognized or seen by the leader, or perhaps not being realized in the current role. And so in this case, a flight risk is an employee that might be thinking about getting ready to leave the organization. So on the other hand, unverified potential suggests that while the leader rates an employee highly, the ratings are not being corroborated by assessment results. So these are a couple of examples of some distinctions that aren't quite made in the original 9-box we went through. And as mentioned previously, this grid takes a mostly forward-looking approach, focusing mostly on potential. So now that we have a high-level overview of what this grid looks like, let's talk about the tools that you'll need to obtain scores and kind of plot employees on this actual grid. And like I said, in a bit, we'll also be returning to the grid to see an example of how it can be populated. So the first source of data used to populate Sigma's 9-box is the Leadership Skills Profile Revised, or LSPR assessment. The LSPR is a personality-based assessment of potential, and as such is not really a reflection of ability or performance. So employees respond to sets of personality items, which are then used to predict their leadership abilities. And in this way, assessments add an objective element to the potential identification process, as opposed to just relying on other ratings. Another point here is that adding an assessment, it also involves the employee in the process, which can help support perceptions of a fair process because the employee actually has some input into it. And so this can be helpful for ensuring that your talent development efforts are well received by your employees. The LSPR focus report provides a leadership solution that simplifies development by clearly identifying the traits that employees can realistically develop quickly and actually strengthen their day-to-day performance. And the report also includes an easy-to-use development guide to support either self-directed or coaching augmented leadership development. This is kind of a quick summary of what you receive in the context of the LSPR focus report. So as the name suggests, concise and focused. Sigma's My Zone feature highlights the competencies that are the most immediate opportunities for development. There's also dynamic customized narrative feedback that provides insight into how personality may affect the employee's leadership ability. And like I said, the integrated development guide facilitates either self-guided, self-directed, or guided development efforts. All right, so that's the assessment rated source of data for Sigma's 9-box. So now let's go to the second source of data, which is the leader rated potential. So to facilitate leader ratings of an employee potential, Sigma has developed the Talent Review Survey, which we'll be looking at shortly. And the Talent Review Survey guides leaders in rating employees on performance, initiative, feedback, strategic alignment, and relationships. And at the end, it provides a very readily interpretable overall score. Okay, so on your screen here, this is what the Talent Review Survey actually looks like. This is what leaders would see when they're rating employees on these dimensions. Sorry. So first of all, this is where performance went. So performance is part of the 5 criteria here, but is not a standalone criterion. So some conceptual definitions here. Performance shows strong performance in current role. Initiative takes advantage of opportunities to lead and develop. Feedback takes feedback well and shows growth over time. Strategic alignment, so supporting the company's overall mission and vision. And then relationships is respected by supervisors, peers, direct reports, etc. So each dimension here is rated on a 5-point scale ranging from 1, not true of this person, to 5, extremely true of this person. And so with 5 dimensions, this means that scores can range from 5 to 25. As mentioned before, one of the benefits of this survey is visual clarity, so to speak. All the information needed and the actual structure is provided to the rater. And it's also provided in a visually appealing manner. And at the end gives a clear total score. So that's one of the benefits. This clearly divides the dimensions of interest, and you'll see some overlap here between this and the qualities, the potential qualities that we spoke to earlier. And the systematic rating process can also be helpful in improving rater accuracy. So at this point, you might be wondering, how do I take scores from the LSPR assessment that you showed us and this survey, and then actually use them in the 9-box tool? So fortunately, we also have an answer for that. On your screen now, you'll see our scoring bands. So Sigma also provides very clear scoring bands, which allow you to categorize each employee as low, medium, or high on both assessment and leader rated potential. So once you have assessment rated, LSPR potential, and talent review survey scores, you can easily map them onto 9-box using the criteria shown on this slide. And so something to note here is that this saves the effort of having to conceptually define performance yourself and develop the associated normative scoring bands. And also gets around a lot of the ambiguity associated with what does high potential actually mean? Because again, the talent review survey provides a very clear scoring guide. So now that we know where our scores are coming from, now that we know how these correspond to the 9 boxes on the grid, we can go through a very quick example of the scoring bands in action. So let's suppose we have an employee, in this case, Reggie. Reggie completed the LSPR assessment and was also rated by his direct superior on the talent review survey dimensions we just talked about. The leader has also previously noted that Reggie has been expressing dissatisfaction with his current role. And so with an assessment rated potential score of 88 and a leader rated potential score of 10, we would place Reggie into the hidden potential box. And so again, this is not definitive, but it could suggest several things. For example, Reggie's current role might not be a good fit for him, and consequently, there isn't enough opportunity for him to actually express his potential. And so the leader is actually not seeing it. In this situation, the employee and the manager might wish to have a candid discussion about ways to improve the situation and look at what some of the root causes for this might be. So as you can see, very easy to take scores from both sources and clearly plot them onto the grid. Now, let's say we take that process we just did and we repeat it with 4 other employees, we might end up with something like this. And this is what I was getting at earlier, a sort of bird's eye view of how your talent pool is dispersed on this grid. And so once you see this, you can kind of think about beginning to create development plans for your employees. So like I said, for someone like Reggie, a discussion as a starting point might be necessary with his manager. Or for someone like Sam in the bottom right corner, we might look to the customized development suggestions and guided activities in the LSPR output to potentially move them up the y-axis on the grid. And then perhaps for some, like Yasmin in this case, there are no immediate concerns. So we can just make sure she continues to be supported in her current role and supported in progression through the organization. So having talked about all of that, I just wanted to touch on a few kind of additional tips and things you might consider when going through this process. So the grid should be filled in by leaders who are directly familiar with the employee and their work. Of course, not doing so can result in less accurate and less fair ratings. It's important to always double check your scores because how important and consequential the talent development process is for employees and for the organization as a whole. It is critical that each step is checked, maybe even rechecked, and then also carefully documented. It's also important to maintain ongoing communication with employees that are involved in this whole process. Because once you set an employee on a talent development path, you should emphasize the importance of having an open door to communicate about how things are going. And so on that note, set clear objectives and check in often. So make sure that the employee knows what they're working towards, and possibly when some deadlines might be. Whether or not that's helpful kind of depends on the situation. But having vague goals or things that are not time bound is generally not very helpful. So that is something that you might consider. Also, update the grid on a regular basis to help ensure accountability. And in other words, look at documenting progress throughout this process. And a kind of higher order point here is the importance of fostering a culture that embraces development and also making sure that employees actually have time for these development initiatives. Because this whole endeavor is of little use if your high potential employees don't have time for the professional development and also don't feel supported in the process, right? So those are some things to consider. So a quick recap of the required materials to complete the Sigma 9-box template. So first, assessing the potential of employees. Leaders complete the talent review survey, which provides leader-rated potential results. And then employees complete the LSPR to determine assessment-rated potential. So for a detailed step-by-step guide on how to use our resources and assessments, including the 9-box in talent development, please make sure to check out our high potential talent development guide. So again, just to kind of summarize some key takeaways from the things that we have discussed so far. So results from the Sigma 9-box can be used to inform resource allocation decisions, supporting organizations in determining where to actually invest and investing in the right employees. The tool can help leaders understand where there may be areas of vulnerability in the talent pool, such as potential flight risks, like Reggie, who we discussed earlier. The 9-box can also provide a framework for documenting HR decisions and also assisting with planning for future staffing needs. And then finally, and we did talk about this earlier at the start, the 9-box can serve as a discussion starter with all the stakeholders in the talent development process. So alongside an understanding of its limitations, the 9-box could be a useful adjunct to your talent development program. However, again, despite all of these benefits, despite the value of the 9-box tool, organizations still often struggle with planning large-scale talent development initiatives. So on that note, we also would like to hear from you. What are the greatest challenges your company faces when implementing strategic plans such as talent development initiatives? Okay, we have again a sort of equal-ish distribution throughout these options. So I guess the top one here is standardization. In this case, using something like the Sigma template with clear criteria and established rating guidelines can help. In terms of facilitating some sort of buy-in from the organization, which is related to time because you need buy-in in order to actually carve out the time to do these things, perhaps pointing towards the positive outcomes that are associated with thoughtful investment in talent development processes, perhaps that might help. And on that note, that could help with a lot of these options here. So improving dedication, actually getting some sort of buy-in and really carving out that meaningful time to implement these things. Yeah, okay, very interesting. So let's move on closer to the end here. So we have seen how challenging talent development initiatives can be for leaders to implement within organizations. So working with a consultant could be beneficial for several reasons. So first of all, working with a consultant can save you a good deal of time and administrative costs. Consultants use time-tested strategies that have worked for other organizations that are facing very similar challenges. Consultants can also act as strategic partners of sorts that help you remain accountable to your own goals while also remaining objective and assisting with unbiased decision making. And finally, consultants have expertise and experience. This is a result of having a foundation of scientific and business knowledge, as well as working with many past clients who experience very similar challenges. So in sum, engaging an HR consultant allows companies to save valuable time and resources by leveraging expertise to streamline HR processes, possibly resulting in significant cost savings and allowing organizations to focus on their core business objectives, which is what they do best. So we already touched on the benefits of the LSPR. I would encourage you to contact us if you have any questions or you think it might be a helpful tool for you and your organization. If you aren't sure if it's for you, you can also test drive the assessment and our platform for free. And as mentioned before, please take advantage of our free talent development resources. You can also work with our consultants to accomplish months of talent development work in a minimal number of sessions. You can also participate in individual or group coaching, as well as register for our Lunch and Learn seminars. So in terms of content, that is all for me. I want to thank you all again for attending today. Just wanted to open up the floor to any sort of questions that you might have, and I will do my best to address those.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Leonid. Just before we hop into the questions, I see we've got a few in our Q&A. I'm going to drop a little message in the chat for you. There's some links here to the templates that we've shown throughout the webinar, the Sigma's 9-box template, as well as the talent review survey and the LSPR, the free trial, and the talent development services. So here you go. There's a lot in there. Feel free to copy and paste that into another tab so that you can explore on your own time once the webinar has been closed. All right. I'm going to work through these questions just in the order that they were submitted throughout the webinar. But like we said before, if you have any other questions that come up from our conversation, feel free to keep putting them in that Q&A box and we will monitor as we go. All right, Leo, first question for you. How do you balance between the assessment rated potential, which is a little more objective, and the leader potential, which is a bit more subjective when filling out Sigma's 9-box template?
Good question. So really, in a sense, it is kind of balanced for you. So you have the scoring bands, and the benefit here is that when with these assessments, which are developed in-house, we kind of understand the scoring norms and how that might be distributed. So that kind of saves you work on that front. So I guess my answer there would be, if you use the scoring bands for each tool and use those bands to plot employees on the 9-box grid, there isn't any relative weighting or balancing that you necessarily have to do. Of course, after the fact, when you have the scores, people are at liberty to kind of pay attention to the details of one or the details of another, maybe look at what dimensions were rated highly or potentially not as highly. Similarly, within the LSPR, you could look at the very nuanced and personalized output that you get. So that can help you with weighting things in terms of decision making, but in terms of just the numerical component, that is largely kind of done already. Hopefully that answers the question.
Thanks, Leo. I think I'll also recap for this one because it was submitted before I believe we got into the talent review survey. That part of that second template that Leo shared with you is to try to help introduce some data-driven processes into the leader rated potential so that you're not just going off of a general sense of, on a scale of 1 to 10, I would rate someone a 7. Sigma's consultants have built into that template a little bit of a structure that can help you make it less subjective. All right, next question. What can be some characteristics or indications of unverified potential? So someone who would be in that bottom right corner of high leader rating, but low assessment rated potential.
High leader rating, but low assessment potential. Okay, one second. Let me read that. I'm trying to picture the 9 boxes in my head. The characteristics or indications. Yeah, well, in some situations, let's say not every employee necessarily wants to move up in the organization. Not every employee has to. So while the leader might see a lot of potential in the employee and rate them very highly, it's not necessarily the case that the employee has this drive to move up to the next position or assume more responsibility or kind of take on things of that nature. So that's kind of the one example that comes to mind there. I can't quite give a prototypical example of how that would manifest in an organization, but from a scoring and numerical standpoint, that is very easy to see when you combine the assessment ratings with the leader ratings.
It's a great answer. I think we've seen that before with clients. We've had our consultants always stress that you want to make sure that you're talking to people before you nominate them as a succession candidate for a role to say, do you really want that? So definitely something that comes up frequently in organizations. Okay, next question is, have we ever thought about using 360-degree questionnaires for leaders and internal clients in determining potential?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so 360-degree assessments are more commonly used in the context of performance appraisal. We actually have a tool, it's called Sigma Radius, which facilitates that process as well. But when it comes to ratings, other ratings or leader ratings of potential itself, in a way, the talent review survey does take into account others because there's a criteria there. There's a question asking about relationships. And so if a leader is familiar with the employee, has had sufficient time to observe the employee in a working environment over a sufficient course of time, that is probably sufficient in terms of speaking to their capability, possibly of moving up within the organization. And the leader too is occupying a position that is superior to this individual hypothetically. And so probably has a good understanding of the sorts of responsibilities that are associated with moving up into a higher order position. So I guess that's an idea, using a more kind of using more sources to populate something like the talent review survey. But at present, that is not something that we are doing.
Thanks, Leo. Okay, we've got a lot of questions coming in here. This is great. Do we offer assessments in the European market? I'm going to answer this quickly. Our assessments are mostly online and facilitated via a virtual platform, so anyone can access them anywhere. Of course, there are language barriers, though. Some of our assessments have been translated into French, but that is the only expansion. So depending on what you're looking for in terms of language and requirements, we may be able to help you. Take a look at the website, explore there. And if you have any more questions, feel free to use the contact us tab to describe your situation and maybe where your departments are, and we can see what we can do for you. Okay, thinking of transparency, what are the concerns related to what leaders actually think, and how transparent should that be for employees? Great question.
Yeah, so I think a good parallel example to this is, let's think of routine performance appraisals. How do you approach providing feedback to an employee that may not be rated particularly highly? So some of the ideas I think that we touched on earlier is when, first of all, the processes should be transparent, and evidence generally suggests that when employees are provided with information about how the process works and how exactly they're being rated, their perceptions of the process are more likely to be positive. So when thinking about this, let's suppose you have to present show an employee that they were rated perhaps not as highly as desired on some dimension. Framing these things as opportunities for development and things that can be changed, right? Things that we can work on, not as something, not as this is an innate quality of the employee that is set in stone, I think that could help soften that concern. There's no getting around the fact that some employees might just react more negatively than others, despite all of your best efforts. But I think reframing this as a developmental opportunity might help.
Thank you. Great answer. Okay, working through here. Here's our next one. What personality or psychometric tests could we use apart from the LSPR for leadership potential or performance?
That's a very difficult question. I can't point you to any direct alternatives, and developing personality and psychometric tests takes a lot of time and a lot of resources, and a lot of very educated statisticians and whatnot. So I can't really point you and say, oh, this is a good alternative. Um, the the distinction there becomes more, you can't just, for example, take a personality questionnaire and just interpret it readily, because it wouldn't give you a lot. So I'm not sure I can just concretely tell you exactly what personality or psychometric tests you could use. Um, the other issue there is when you're trying to predict someone's performance on something, like the question might be, well, what exactly are you trying to predict? What qualities are you trying to speak to? And this gets back to the thing that I said over and over, and apologies if it was annoying throughout the presentation, but the distinction between performance and potential, what do those look like in the context of your organization? So I think I'm probably not the best person in this case to ask. Once you have clear conceptual definitions of what it is you want to kind of speak to or measure, then you can think about, okay, well, what tools can I use to approach that problem?
Yeah, I'll give an example. As a case, Sigma also has emotional intelligence assessments. So if for whatever reason, your company focuses on something like that, or a particular subset of leadership skills, then you can look at assessments that target those. The LSPR that we have has a benchmarking function, which lets you narrow down the report to specifically what you're looking at, which might be like the cognitive side of the leadership skills, or it might be more interpersonal or personal skills. So you can tailor it a little bit that way. And we have worked with different organizations who are already using different assessments. So of course, our template is geared a little bit more to our assessments so that they're cohesive, but you can still be using our templates to support any current assessments that you're doing inside of your organization. Follow-up question is something I said earlier, or we said earlier, asking people if they're interested in potential promotion or succession. Situations change, so should we ask that every 3, 6, 12 months? I'll just answer that quickly and say that our consultants usually recommend as a best practice revisiting any plan for talent development or succession around every 6 months. So you definitely do want to be revisiting that. Thought I'd just share that with the group because that is a very helpful clarification point. Okay, and I think our last question. Oh no, we've had one more come in. Okay, 2 more questions. So our second last question is, what is the ideal way to incorporate a performance rating, an average of the last few years, quarters, or just the most recent performance evaluations?
Right. So again, I'm gonna have to defer to the "it depends" answer because um, for some employees might not have been there for that long. So in that case, you would cut out some of those options. Um, it also depends on what the standard performance review actually looks like within an organization, what things are the employees rated on. So this gets back to the point about looking at what performance metrics are available to you, um, if you're using them in some way, and think about which of those are actually most relevant to what you're trying to look at or predict. Um, another let's if you okay, if you know, for example, that there was something that happened within your organization which would make, let's say, this past performance review not really a good indicator. Again, I don't know, you would know best. um, then you could consider maybe discounting that because you know that something was happening and it's maybe not a very good indicator. But again, it really just depends on what the performance rating is, how it was constructed, how often, etc.
Thanks, Leo. Okay, last question, because I do need to wrap up some announcements as well, especially for our SHRM professional development credit attendees. But the last question we'll do together is, what are your thoughts on using the NeoPI to create a talent profile for behavioral tendencies from existing high potentials? You know what, that is a very specific question. I'm going to follow up with you via email and actually pull in some of our R&D team for this, because I want to get you the best answer that we possibly can. So we will pull in our experts specific to that assessment for you as well. Okay, so just before we wrap up, I see we've got a couple minutes left of our webinar here. I'm going to launch a very brief poll. This is for our participants who are here to get professional development credits from either SHRM or ATD. If you do not want this or don't know what I'm talking about, you don't need to fill out the poll. But for those of you who do want this professional development credit for SHRM, I'm going to need to create a certificate for you. So please just hit yes there, and then I'll know to use your name on a completion certificate. And if you like what you saw here, we do have monthly webinars happening throughout the year and would love for you to join us in the future. So again, I'm going to drop a link in the chat for you, and then you can take a look. We've got a variety of different topics. We had a couple questions. I'm sorry we didn't get to everything, but we had a couple questions in the Q&A box on succession in particular, and we do have quite a few webinars on that. That is one of Sigma's areas of expertise. So we would encourage you to take a look. And if there's something that you'd really like to see as a webinar but don't see on the calendar, feel free to contact us, send us an email. We're always looking for more resources or tools that we can make to support people in the talent development that they're doing. All right, I will close this poll. Thank you, everyone. And that's it from us today. So if you have questions, for those of you who we didn't get to in the Q&A, I'm very sorry. Please shoot us a quick email. We would love to respond to you. We'd be happy to resend more resources if you need any. And like I said, the recording for this webinar will be up tomorrow at the latest. So thank you all for joining us. We hope it was a helpful webinar, and all the best to you as you head off on your talent development journeys.